Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Daryl Wing-Soo, and again, this is part of the lecture series on counseling the culturally diverse theory and practice. Today's topic deals with how we overcome barriers and become effective or culturally competent multicultural counselors and therapists. Last time I had mentioned that one of the things that really got me interested in terms of multicultural counseling and therapy was a study that my brother Stan did at the University of Washington, in which he investigated or took a survey of the entire mental health system in the state of Washington with respect to utilization of mental health facilities by 5 major groups. These were Asian American clients, African American clients, Latino Hispanic American clients, Native American clients, and white clients. What he found was something quite startling, and the results were that racial ethnic minority clients tended to underutilize traditional mental health services, and once they did utilize the services, they tended to prematurely terminate at a high rate after the first initial contact. In fact, what he found in his study was that many of the clients of color, regardless of the ethnic group that they came from, over 50% terminated after the first initial contact. And this was in marked contrast to less than 50% termination rate among their white counterparts. Now, the question that appeared before my brother Stan and I was to ask the question, why was this so? Why is it that clients of color tend to underutilize traditional health facilities and at the same time, when they did come in, tended to terminate at such a high rate after the first initial contact? Now, today, I'm not going to really be addressing the issues of why they underutilize mental health facilities, because that deals with the whole issue of what we call potential institutional bias and racism. For example, the location of the services, how the services are advertised, and how they are implemented may discourage actively racial ethnic minority groups from attending. What I do want to talk about is this issue of why, once they come in for counseling and therapy, that they tended to drop out at such a high rate. Now, we can entertain a number of possible explanations. One of them is that it's possible that clients of color are mentally healthier and don't need services as much as their white counterpart and are cured after the initial first contact. Now, I say that in tongue-in-cheek because I really don't believe it. But it's ironic in the past that we have pathologized clients of color or people of color in terms of saying that they are mentally unhealthier and pathological. Now we have some data that might indicate something else. In essence, what Stan and I began to look at was that perhaps it is the inappropriateness of the interactions between the traditional mental health provider and the culturally diverse clients who came in for counseling and psychotherapy. We know, for example, that one of the qualities of effective counseling and therapy is the building of what we call a therapeutic alliance. Now, this is something that doesn't seem to happen very well when client and counselor differ from one another in terms of race, culture, ethnicity. Something is happening in which the inappropriateness of the transactions is going on between these clients here. And this led us to begin to explore carefully what are the generic characteristics of counseling and psychotherapy that might explain these premature termination rates that are going on between clients. Now, to do that required us to carefully look at the process of counseling and psychotherapy from the Western perspective. And let me just quickly define what we mean by counseling and psychotherapy. For effective counseling and psychotherapy to occur, we have to define the process as one of an interpersonal interaction between client and counselor and high communication. For effective counseling to occur, both the client and counselor must be able to send and receive both verbal and nonverbal messages accurately and appropriately. These are key concepts that we will show you very shortly in terms of PowerPoint slides, either in handouts or ones that will come up very shortly. The qualities of send and receive. As a helping professional, I have to be able to send messages, make myself understood to my clients very clearly. Likewise, I have to be able to receive messages, to understand them, to attend to their feelings, the content of what they are saying, and what is happening in order to understand their worldview. Likewise, our clients have to be able to make themselves known to us by sending us communications and receiving them at the same time. And the sending and receiving occurs through verbal and nonverbal communication. In traditional mental health counseling, we rely heavily on verbal communication and less likely on nonverbal communication. Indeed, counseling and psychotherapy has frequently been called the talking cure or talk therapies. The primary medium by which we do our work is through words and verbalizations. Now, what psychologists have found, however, is that only 30 to 40% of the message of a communication is done verbally, which means that between 60 to 70% is done non-verbally. So in essence, if we as mental health providers tune in primarily to verbal communications, which is something Western society does, and that other cultural groups tend to rely heavily on nonverbal communication and understanding, then we begin to have some idea of possible discrepancies that are occurring. That many cultural groups tend to communicate what is going on for them non-verbally more than verbally. And the other thing that makes this very difficult for mental health providers is that nonverbal communications oftentimes vary with respect to the cultural context. In the United States, you show attentiveness by looking at the speaker as they speak. In many cultures, however, avoidance of eye contact is dictated as a sign of respect for someone that is older and wiser. So if you begin to think about this issue playing out in a therapeutic situation where you are a mental health professional working with a client of color, if you are dealing, for example, with a traditional Asian client, that Asian client may not make eye contact with you. And this can create misinterpretations of what might be happening with the client. For example, you might interpret that the client is shy, passive, sneaky, and not telling the truth, when indeed it is showing you a sign of, the client is showing you a sign of respect. Another quality that we will look at is that counseling and psychotherapy traditionally has depended very much on the accuracy of communication. We oftentimes say, define the problem and solve it. If our clients come in, we have to identify the task and go about trying to resolve the issues that are confronting our client. We get to the heart of the matter. We don't beat around the bush. These are aspects of counseling and psychotherapy, very characteristic of Western forms of communication. However, among many cultural groups, appropriateness of communication is equally as important as the accuracy of communication. I have said this several times in this lecture series that many cultural groups value subtlety and indirectness as a highly prized art. And the confrontation and directness of traditional counseling and psychotherapy may be seen as being offensive, rude, and lacking in respect for the client, despite the fact that the therapist has the best intentions possible. Well, let us define counseling and psychotherapy from a Western perspective. Counseling and psychotherapy has traditionally been defined as conversations with a therapeutic purpose, as the development of therapeutic alliances for the purpose of catharsis or an opportunity to develop or change behaviors, attitudes, insights, or feelings. You can note that change is the crucial element and that the helping professional tries to get the client to, in some sense, change what might be occurring or causing them problems. Likewise, counseling and psychotherapy, we pride ourselves in the Western tradition that is based upon scientifically grounded psychological principles. And lastly, as I've indicated previously, it is oftentimes referred to as the talking cure. In fact, some people have said that counseling and psychotherapy on a common level is what they call the purchase of friendship. That is that because you don't have a friend to talk to, you pay a mental health professional to come in to talk to you in order to relieve anxieties or issues that might be occurring with you. Well, there are essential 5 commonalities that I want you to think about when we begin to talk about potential barriers to effective cross-cultural or multicultural counseling. One of them, from the Western perspective, is that counseling is seen as centered in the I-thou relationship, and the counselor-client relationship that occurs primarily on a one-to-one basis. Secondarily, as I've indicated, the primary mode of dispensing help is through talking or verbal behavior. Thirdly, the goal of counseling is to change behaviors, cognitions, feelings, attitudes, and to develop insights. Now, the emphasis of these depends upon your theoretical orientation. If you're behaviorally oriented, behavior change is a focus. If you are psychodynamically oriented, insight is the focus. If you are cognitively oriented, changing cognitions is the focus of the behavior. But despite what theoretical orientation you take, change, the focus is on change. Fourth, mental health professionals emphasize, as I've indicated, the importance of basing therapeutic interventions on well-grounded social, psychological, or psychological principles. Now, if we begin to look at these definitions of counseling and psychotherapy, I have indicated that as a psychologist, my role as a helping professional is defined for me. I adhere to what we call standards of practice in the American Psychological Association and codes of ethics that dictate for me what are ethical forms of behavior for a helping professional or psychologist to engage in. In our research with respect to these codes and with respect to the standards, what we have found is that these are culture bound. And because they are culture bound, we were able to extract what we call 5 therapeutic taboos that I want you, throughout your reading of Counseling the Culturally Diverse, to think carefully about the implications it has on you in your delivery of culturally appropriate services. One of them is that we are told that as a helping professional, as a counselor or a therapist, you do not give advice and suggestions to your client. That is considered a therapeutic taboo because there is great fear that it will foster dependency, and we want our clients to solve problems on their own. The second therapeutic taboo is that as a helping professional, we are told not to self-disclose our thoughts and feelings, what may be going on within us, because it is considered unprofessional. That it's something that therapists do not do. A third therapeutic taboo that we need to look at carefully is that therapists do not barter with clients. That is, that if a client says that I can't pay for your services, but I will paint your house in return for 6 sessions or something of that nature, that to them may be acceptable and considered bartering, but as a helping professional, we believe that it places us in a conflict of interest and alters the therapeutic relationship. Now, I want you to think about that, and it has basic rationale that indeed might be very operative here. A fourth therapeutic taboo is that therapists do not serve dual role relationships with their clients because there is a loss of objectivity, a potential loss of objectivity. That is that you don't do therapy on your spouse or partner. You don't do therapy with friends or colleagues that you know because there is this potential loss of objectivity that goes on, and it is considered in some sense unethical to do something like that. A fifth therapeutic taboo is that therapists do not accept gifts from clients because it may unduly obligate them. Now, if I go through these therapeutic taboos that dictate what is appropriate and inappropriate or ethical, unethical behavior, most of you out there, and indeed many of my colleagues would believe that there are justifiable rationales for why these taboos operate. They are based upon powerful therapeutic reasons, research into interpersonal effects and obligations that occur. However, what we have is something that really may cause major cultural conflicts. And what I would like to do is talk about these 5 therapeutic taboos with what I call contrasting cultural help-giving imperatives. Let us talk first about the taboo of giving advice and suggestions. The giving of advice and suggestions is perceived as a helping characteristic among many Latino groups. Many Puerto Ricans who go to a helping professional expect the helper to give them advice and suggestions because they are older and wiser. And they tend to, in some sense, perceive the credibility of a helping professional based upon their giving advice and suggestions. The second taboo about helpers or therapists not self-disclosing thoughts and feelings is that we find many African Americans, for example, who believes that the helper's thoughts and feelings are seen as evidence of sincerity, humanness, authenticity, necessary attributes of a helping relationship. A helper or therapist that refuses to disclose thoughts and feelings to, let's say, many African American clients because of their belief in being objective and keeping a professional demeanor with their clients may, in essence, be lowering their credibility because African Americans will perceive this as an indication of lack of sincerity and openness being given. Thirdly, the taboo of bartering. Bartering is an acceptable means of conducting business among many indigenous populations and recognizes, in some sense, culture-bound issues. For example, there are many indigenous cultures in which one barters and trades off services instead of using monetary means of purchasing services from one another. Indeed, if you look at the history of the United States, before we became a monetary economy, that was what people did. Neighbors would get together and help one another, harvest their crops in return for helping another neighbor build their home. So that bartering, in some sense, may have class and cultural implications to this. The fourth taboo that we oftentimes talk about is that gift giving, that therapists don't accept gifts from their clients. In fact, we hear this throughout, that teachers shouldn't accept gifts from students because it's going to unduly obligate them or affect them in how they evaluate their clients or their students when working with them. Among Asian cultures, there is a long-standing historical and cultural sanction of the importance of gift giving as cementing the interpersonal relationship. Many of my colleagues do not realize that when an Asian client or Asians give you gifts, it is an extension of their being and who they are, and to refuse it is to refuse an intimate aspect of that person's identity. It is a culturally, socially accepted thing that occurs. When I lived in California and moved into a neighborhood, I remember that there was a large Asian population in the city that I resided in, and I noted differences among how Asians would function as opposed to our white neighbors. For example, if they had a party and almost all my Asian neighbors, including my family, when we went over to someone's house for a dinner or a party, would bring a gift. Now, some of my white neighbors would bring gifts as well, but it was not something that they commonly did. And this was something very, even if it's really quite common now for many of my colleagues to throw a birthday party for a loved one and state on the invitations, no, please, no gifts. In essence, what I've observed is that Asian colleagues continue to bring gifts regardless of that particular statement. And this is something I think that we need to know, that different cultures tend to perceive these rules and regulations quite differently. The last one is that multiple role relationships among many culturally different groups are often associated with greater probability of seeking help. Again, I would use the Black community, the African American community, to illustrate this particular issue here. That if I was to ask you this question, if politicians want to reach the Black community, where do they go? Well, in essence, politicians now know that the Black church represents the central focus of the community. And in essence, many African American clients will seek help from someone that they know, admire, and trust. And oftentimes parishioners will seek help from the head of the church or someone, and as a result, you have a potential conflict in terms of dual relationships. Now, what I am trying to say in terms of talking about these therapeutic taboos is to give you some idea that many of these so-called universal truths that we are taught, principles of effective counseling and psychotherapy, may indeed have major problems or clashes with culturally different groups. If all 5 of these taboos are precisely the characteristics in which a racial ethnic minority, a client of color, defines as a helping relationship, we have a major difficulty and problem here. And that, to me, serves as a basis for one of the primary areas of why we have this high premature termination rate among racial ethnic minorities. Now, to be very specific about this, Let me now focus in directly on what I call the generic characteristics of counseling and psychotherapy that many of you may be at this time reading in the book, Counseling the Culturally Diverse. Many of you know that my brother Stan and I and Dave began to look at the common characteristics of the mental health fields, and we were able to find 3 areas in which, regardless of whether we're talking about psychoanalytic theory, behavioral theory, cognitive theory, human existential theories or not, that there were 3 things that made them, that were common to them, that created clashes. One of them was that most theories of counseling and psychotherapy are culture-bound. That is, they originated from one particular cultural context, and as a result, may not be applicable to other cultural groups that differ from them in terms of life experiences, worldview, and cultural values. And some of these culture-bound values we're going to look at very shortly in quite a bit of detail. The second thing is class-bound values. Most theories of counseling and psychotherapy assume that clients have time to go in for a session, to sit, to introspect, and to think about what they will do in the future. Now, if you deal with clients in which poverty is a day-to-day survival mode by them, they do not have time to come in and to sit and to take session after session, when indeed what they are countering is, how do I feed my family? Where do I get my job? Where do I get medical services to aid my family when I don't have the financial means to do it? So in some sense, the very definition of counseling and psychotherapy and how it is conducted can indeed be class-bound. And thirdly, a common characteristic of Western counseling and psychotherapy is that it uses standard English and verbalizations as the primary means by which help is delivered. And as a result, many individuals who are not particularly fluent in English, who are bilingual, multilingual, may be placed at a disadvantage in terms of their ability to work effectively with you in terms of the helping relationship. Now, what are some culture-bound values that we have found creates major difficulties for our culturally diverse clients who have, let's say, a much more collectivistic orientation? One of the culture-bound values that I have repeatedly mentioned is that most forms of counseling and psychotherapy focus on the individual. It is individual-centered. It focuses on the I-thou relationship in which the psychosocial unit of operation is the individual. This is not surprising when you look at the fact that the United States arose from the concept of rugged individualism. We have sayings that go like this: God helps those who help themselves. You can do it on your own. Autonomy is very important. If you look at almost all theories of human development, whether it be Jean Piaget, whether it be Erik Erikson, or a whole host of other individuals who talk about human development, we talk about the fact that individuation, breaking away from the family, is the road to maturity and autonomy and independence. Now, indeed, what we fail to realize is that many, 3/4 of the world, in fact, I was going to say many groups, but indeed 3/4 of the world, the psychosocial unit of operation is not the individual. It is the family, the group, or the collective society. And collectivism is part of the identity of the individual. Now, I have mentioned this several times, that the individualism, collectivism dimension represents a major force in determining one's worldview, how you define problems, how you behave. If you, for example, are working with a Latino client who has a much more family collectivistic orientation in terms of working with them, and they have done something wrong that they have great regret for, one of the things that we teach therapists to do is to tune in to the feeling tone level. Now, in most cases, if people do things wrong, they are likely to feel guilty. However, it is very possible that you work with a Latino client with a collectivistic orientation. If they do something wrong, they may feel guilt, but the dominant feeling that they may have is one of shame and disgrace. And I submit to you, shame is a group affect, while guilt is an individual affect. And as a counselor, a helping professional, if you do not recognize that particular fact, you may misidentify the affective level of communication and the meaning it has for this client in a large sense, even though it may seem like a very minimal, trivial type of difference. It isn't. It represents a major distinction in worldview. Likewise, I give this example because it is always present. You know, when we meet one another and greet each other for the first time, or it's been a while since we've seen one another, the immediate greeting response we have is to say, hey, look at John, how are you today? Or what's going on with you, John? My father, as I've indicated consistently, never greets people like that. If he runs into someone he has not seen, he is going to greet them by asking, how is your family today? I submit again to you that this represents a collectivistic worldview versus an individualistic one. And it is very important that these areas be delineated and demystified so we can begin to understand how things are going. Among many Asian Americans, thinking about yourself is a sign of selfishness. This is something that in fact, a lot of people talk about autonomy and independence. Most of us believe that becoming independent, making decisions on your own, is a sign of maturity, autonomy, and is something very healthy. In fact, I have encountered this frequently with colleagues years ago when I was working at a counseling center at Berkeley, California. Many of my colleagues would describe Chinese clients that they work with as excessively dependent. And I would follow up, well, what makes you say that? And they would tell stories about giving clients, let's say, the Strong Campbell interest inventory. Perhaps they're doing vocational counseling. And the vocational results come out indicating that they shouldn't be in engineering. They should be in a field like agriculture. And the counselors would say that it looks like maybe you could consider changing your major. And they would tell me that many Chinese clients would make statements like, before I can do that, I have to talk to my folks about it. And they would immediately jump to the fact, well, how immature. You know, if you know anything about transactional analysis, what we consider to be a less stage of development is what we call the parent-child relationship. And they jumped to the conclusion that these Asian clients that they worked with were immature because they had to run to mommy in order to make a change in their major, and how immature, dependent they were. And I would say that these counselors overlooked the fact that, again, it was much more a collective. One doesn't make decisions on your own. If you come from a collectivistic orientation, there are many factors that people oftentimes don't understand. For example, let me give you another one that may drive home if I do something well, if I indeed excel in school, bring honor in my work role, I not only bring honor to me as an individual, but to the entire Sioux family. My entire family feels proud and pride in that. And I feel proud that they share in that as well. It isn't that I bring individual recognition to me and I did it on my own. I did it from the constellation of my family and the identity with my family. Likewise, if I fail in school, if I suffer, if I engage in antisocial behavior, such as juvenile delinquency, if I suffer from a mental disorder, I bring potential shame, not only to myself, but to the entire family. And as a result, the entire family has much to say about going public with these particular areas, and we will talk about this later when we get to the another component of a generic characteristic of counseling that says self-disclosure is important. Cultural factors oftentimes dictate the degree to which culturally diverse clients will disclose to you, and if you don't understand what is happening to the client, you will be shut off. You will create a therapeutic impasse between your ability to work with a client. The other thing that I find oftentimes disturbing about the focus on the individual is that oftentimes we become guilty of individual blame as well. If someone, and we know this from from studies about in the field of social psychology, that if teachers describe, if teachers are given a description of a student who has gotten straight A's, let's say Mary is a 13-year-old student in a class, she's gotten straight A's, she's gotten honors and award. What do you think are the reasons by which Mary has achieved so well? Well, teachers in these studies will generally mark things like, well, Mary's exceptionally bright, she's intelligent, or that Mary worked hard, she's got great stick-to-itiveness. Now, all of the reasons given for her success are individual reasons. They are internal reasons about why Mary succeeded. Let me give you the opposite end here. Supposing Mary is described to teachers as a student who has gotten primarily C's and D's and a few F's and is not doing well in school. What are the reasons that you would give to why Mary isn't doing well? Now, again, an individual-centered explanation that is a tendency for educators make is that, well, Mary isn't very bright, or that she's lazy, she's unmotivated, she's easily distracted. All those are internal attributes about why Mary is failing or not succeeding. Like when Mary was successful, those were internal attributes at the same time. They're focused upon explaining outcomes on the basis of individual effort or individual characteristics. How many of you would entertain the notion, in the first case that Mary is doing well, that maybe Mary cheats? That's why she does well. Or that maybe Mary is teacher's pet and gets good grades as a result of that. And likewise, if Mary doesn't do well, how many of us entertain the fact that maybe Mary is being discriminated against by the teacher, or that maybe Mary comes from a family that requires her to work in a family business, and she has no ability to, no energies or time to put in to her studies. Those are external explanations. Now, the issue here that I want you to think carefully about that is important is that when we begin to work with a culturally diverse population, that many of their current life situations, high unemployment, a lower education, many of these issues, especially if we talk about Black and Latino clients, may be due to external reasons, not the fact that they're lazy, that they're unintelligent, that they're unmotivated, and so forth, but that they are placed in a situation of discrimination, of prejudice, and a systemic force that prevents them from excelling well. And this was something long ago, in 1967, when Ryan wrote a book called Blaming the Victim. Blaming the victim that he talks about is very similar to this example, that women who are raped are oftentimes blamed for having enticed the rapist to rape them. This is truly blaming the victim. So if we begin to broaden our understanding of the individual system focus, and we begin to say that maybe people of color are in this society disadvantaged by virtue of external forces, and that this is where the locus of our efforts should be, rather in some sense that we explain or assess personal deficiencies that are going on. And so I say to you again, don't let the individual-centered approach of counseling and psychotherapy create tunnel vision in you, where your total perception is that it is the individual apart from societal or external forces that may be going on. So think about both the social, political, and the cultural factors that may influence the individual versus collectivistic identity that goes on. Another culture-bound value that I would like to share with you today is our belief that counseling and psychotherapy values verbal, emotional, and behavioral expressiveness. And I've said this before, that that one of the potentially culture-bound aspects of counseling is that it uses standard English and it uses words as the medium of cure and talk, when indeed many cultural groups, nonverbal communication is very important. My former colleague, Dr. Alvin Jones, an African-American psychologist who worked with me closely, exemplifies this. If he comes into a room and sees some fine-looking women that he finds very attractive, he might come over to me and go, by tapping the things. Now, in this way, he has communicated to me what might take a white colleague paragraphs to communicate. And this is something that we have found out that many African Americans use less words to communicate the same content, but more nonverbals to communicate what is happening. And if the counselor, a therapist, is unaware of this, they are going to be seriously disadvantaged in their ability to relate to the client that is going on here. The second aspect of verbal, emotional, behavioral expressiveness deals with the expression of feelings. We usually want people to express their feelings in counseling and psychotherapy. What is going on with you? Are you angry? Tell me what you're feeling. We want to tap or touch the feeling tone level of our clients here. In many cultures, restraint of strong feelings is highly valued. I want you to think about that, and this is especially true of a traditional Asian culture. My father used to call me immature because I couldn't control my feelings. From his perspective, I was impulsive, And he felt that wisdom and maturity was in one's ability to control not just negative feelings, but positive feelings. Public displays of affection were also discouraged. It does not mean that Asians are unfeeling people. We express feelings differently and through a different means. It simply means that behaviorally, the means by which others express feelings are not the medium by which we do it. And as a result, oftentimes, Asian American clients get mistakenly labeled as being repressed, inhibited, out of touch with their feelings. These are all terms in the field of mental health that are considered pathological, and we want people to express feelings that are going on. The other thing is behavioral expressiveness. That is that we want people to be assertive. Years ago, there was this whole movement in terms of assertiveness training. Now, again, in fact, there were books that were written. Some of the old ones that I recalled was Stand Up for Your Own Rights. These were all self-help books. Or When I Say No, I Feel Guilty. They all encouraged people that you have a right to tell people to move to the back of the line when you're waiting for in line for a movie and they crowd in front of you. Or you have a right to tell the waiter who served you that the food that they have brought out is not up to the standard that you're using. These are rights. These are behavioral rights that people talked about. And we had many programs of assertiveness training. And we tended to describe individuals as passive, needing to be able to stand up for their own rights and not be a doormat to the world. Now, again, let me go back to this issue that, and I say it all the time, that many groups believe direct expressions of anger, behavioral expressions, are culturally inappropriate. Indirectness, subtlety are more valued in terms of how you deal with the situation. And this was truly so when we began to look at the culture of Native Americans and of Chinese and Japanese Americans, that this was a dictate that they went through. One example I like to give is that many of you, they still show these tapes in your counseling therapy classes. Remember the Gloria tapes? These were tapes in which Gloria, a white female client, worked with three renowned psychotherapists, Carl Rogers, Albert Ellis, and Fritz Perls. These were demonstrations about differences in working style. Now, many of you, and maybe if you haven't seen it, I would encourage you strongly to ask your professors or get hold of these early 3 Worlds of Psychotherapy tapes that illustrated the different techniques. But Gloria, the white woman client, worked with all 3 of them to illustrate the differences in style and technique. And of course, if any of you know Gestalt therapy, working with Fritz Perls, the belief of Gestalt therapy is that it is important to be in touch with the here and now. The future has not come, the past is gone. And that clients who run from the here and now are indeed escaping responsibility. That's why when they talk about the past, they are avoiding the here and now. When they talk about the future, they are avoiding here and now. So the role of a therapist is to get that person in touch with the here and now and accept their existence. This is very existential and Gestalt in orientation. In working with Gloria, you recall, what happened was that Gloria came in, sat down, and she began her session by saying how anxious and scared she was. Now, Perls, however, noted that she had a smile on her face. And so Perls said to her, you say that you're very scared and anxious, but you have a smile on your face. And in another session, when Gloria was seated with her legs crossed, she began to, as she was talking about an area that was bothersome to her, she started to jiggle her feet. And Pearls looked down and pointed at her feet and said, "What are you doing with your feet now?" Now, all of these techniques are traditional techniques that are used in terms of Gestalt therapy. That is that if you get the person to recognize their nonverbal behavior, to begin to get the nonverbals consistent with the verbal behavior, they begin to feel the immediacy of the presence in the here and now. It is very appropriate. Many Native Americans also believe in the here and now. The goal of Gestalt therapy, to get people in touch with the here and now, the immediacy of the situation, is something that Native Americans can very much relate to. And as a result, in helping sessions or healing sessions, that would be very consistent. But the process of getting to the here and now, the confrontation that occurs in Gestalt that is evidenced by Fritz Perls and pointing out inconsistencies, would be considered by many Native American clients to be crude and offensive forms of communication that would be disrespectful. And as a result, the appropriateness of those forms of behavior would tend to create a major separation between the therapist and the culturally different client. And that is, again, something that I want you to think about very carefully. Let us now go on to the third major culture-bound value. The third culture-bound value of counseling and psychotherapy is that of insight. In counseling and psychotherapy, in the mental health fields, we usually believe that people who understand their own motivations, dynamics, and conflicts are healthier. And indeed, that is something that we oftentimes talk about, that obtaining insight into the hidden unconscious dynamics that are going on creates a healthier type of individual. In fact, this comes from traditional psychodynamic theory that values insight, leading to symptom removal or behavior change. You know, many of you know that when Freud began to think about the talking cure, that insight was the basis by freeing the ego's defenses from expending psychic energy that would detract from the person's ability to function effectively. And Freud felt that many hysterical symptoms at that time would disappear once the person achieved insight. Now, obtaining insight is a goal that many therapists share, regardless of theoretical orientations. Even the behavioral and cognitivistic schools of thought do talk about insight, maybe in a different way in terms of talking about it, much more of it being aware or unaware of what the impact of your behavior might be doing. There are many cultural groups in which insight may not be highly valued as a dictate or a movement to a mental health anyway. For example, oftentimes when I was younger and would get anxious or be upset with something that was going on in the family, in my family, the appropriate thing to do would be to go to talk to my father if indeed I wanted to change in terms of how we did things in the home situation. Supposing my brother Dave, always did not have to do the dishes and I had to do it all the time and I became angry and upset with it, the person who could change this, the split up of the work would be my father. So I would seek almost an audience with my father and talk to him about the anger I was feeling, the frustration, and maybe jealousy about the fact that my older brother Dave could get away with things, and I had to continue holding up more of the responsibility of the family. Now, I remember oftentimes I'd sit in front of my father and would talk about either that or either the fact that I was anxious about giving a book report in school, feelings I would talk to him about. And you know what his advice would be? Supposing I'm talking to him that tomorrow I have this big book report to give in front of the class, and Dad, I'm anxious about it. He would sit back and do one of two things. Either tell me a fable in which I was to tease out the meaning of that for me, or he would simply sit back and say to me, well, Daryl, don't think about it. Now, I do want you to think about it, and that is that traditionally in mental health fields, we don't tell people not to think about something. We tell them to dive into it, to analyze it, to be introspective, to achieve insight into what is causing all of this, your feelings and why you're behaving the way you do. But my dad's sitting back there and saying, don't think about it. And I remember oftentimes I would have a real strong negative reaction to what he was saying. In fact, he oftentimes would say, follow up by saying, Daryl, the reason why you're anxious is that you're thinking too much about it. And he said that if you think not about yourself, but about the good of the family, these feelings would disappear. Now, again, there were two things going on here. Insight was to him not the road to mental health, and he felt that I was being selfish by thinking on an individual level, and as opposed to the meaning it had for my entire family. So that there were two cultural values that were in action here in terms of what he felt was the way to deal with the situation. And it was only years later, in terms of my development, that I finally understood what my father meant. And it came when I was at the University of California, Berkeley, when a graduate student, Roger Lum, who is now has his doctorate in one of the Alameda County mental health agencies, he did his doctoral dissertation on the perception of Chinese in San Francisco, Chinatown, about qualities that are associated or ways towards movement, towards mental health. And in his doctoral dissertation, the highest correlation with mental health was a factor called avoidance of morbid thinking. Now, this began to make me realize that my father operated from this meaning, that the reason why I felt anxious was that I should stop thinking about it. Thinking about it created anxiety. And also, a stress coping psychologist by the name of Richard Lazarus also did a lot of works at the University at Berkeley on what he called healthy denial. That is, he found that there were many situations in which denial was healthier than attempts to try to think about and work through issues. And he gained great fame with this because in some sense it violated the dictates of psychoanalytic thought that insight leads to a healthier functioning and response. And he was written up in Psychology Today, published a number of articles. And I can share this with you, I've always resented the fact that Richard Lazarus got credit for this when my father knew it before he did, and should have been the one that was recognized in terms of what was going on. But in essence, now we have cognitive behavioral movements in which the use of avoidance of thinking, denial, healthy denial, are legitimate aspects of what is going on, so that in this way, I began to understand clearly that different cultures value different goals and means. Now, supposing we do argue, however, that insight does lead to mental health. Indeed, if you argue that insight is required for therapy, then you have to show that insight results in behavior change, healthy behavior change. And that is one of the things that the behavioral schools of thought have found, that insight does not always lead to behavior change. It creates some major dilemmas. In fact, the behavioral schools of thought have shown that if you change behavior first, it is insight that follows. For example, if you change your behavior, they call it cognitive reorganization or understanding. And this is something that we begin to find. The other thing I would ask you is that you have to define when a person has insight. When does a person have insight? And I would submit to you that the only answer that comes from this is that you have insight when your therapist says that you have insight. And this varies from therapist to therapist and from those holding different theoretical orientations. And an example I can give that would indicate to you that insight doesn't always do well was that when I was very young, well, maybe not that young, it seems like I'm young, in my college, undergraduate, and graduate years, I had great difficulty interacting and asking women out on social occasions and dates and so forth. I'd get real anxious. One of the things I did was to join a fraternity at Oregon State University because I felt like I needed help in developing my social skills and my ability to relate to women. And the stereotype I had was that fraternities would help me do that. And so I joined Phi Delta Kappa, and it became a member of the fraternity. Well, what happened was that during this particular time, during my sophomore year, I would recall a time in which we would have house dances. And all members of the fraternity were expected to ask people out on dates. And of course, I still had not worked through the anxiety that I had. So what I did was that when at our fraternity house meeting, they would announce that we're going to have a house dance on the week of such and such, and it would be 4 weeks away. I usually knew who I would like to ask, but I would say, oh, 4 weeks, I've got plenty of time. In fact, I was procrastinating. Well, 3 weeks during dinner, they'd make the announcement that, remember, start looking, pledges, start looking for dates to bring to the house function. I would begin to feel a little bit more anxious that I better get going, otherwise the woman that I wanted to ask out would be asked out by someone else. And then it would be 2 weeks before the event. I would not have done anything because I was still hung up with anxiety. A week before, and then maybe the night before, I'd pick up the phone, ask the young woman out, and of course she'd say, no, I can't do it. And I would feel shattered. Now, I went for counseling at the counseling center to help me try to understand what was going on. And during those sessions, I believe I achieved a great deal of insight about myself. One of the things I realized was that I feared rejection, that in some sense rejection made a statement of my worth as a human being. But besides that, more specifically, I saw rejection as a powerful statement of my masculinity. In some sense, the masculinity issue really bothered me. So I would engage in behaviors. See, if I asked that young lady out 4 weeks before the house dance and got rejected, then it was different than if I called her the night before and got rejected. Now, can you realize, understand why that would be? Because by asking the night before and getting rejected, I had an excuse. I should have given her greater warning, and that's the reason. If I asked 4 weeks, that excuse might be gone, and I would have to confront the fact that maybe I'm unattractive as a man, and that's the reason women would not like me. I went through all of this, and in counseling, that insight really made me feel good. It was really a major breakthrough that we dealt session after session with it. But that insight never helped me pick up the phone any earlier to call the young women that I wanted to go out with on social occasions. And it had to be done quite differently. My behavior had to be worked on and changed. So that what we have here is that insight does not always lead to functional behavior change. And when we begin to bring those issues out, many of my colleagues would respond by saying, well, maybe insight doesn't lead to all the time to behavior change, but insight is important in itself. Now, the moment that that statement was made, it was clear to me that insight represented a strong value, not a legitimate one on therapeutic reasons, but it was a value statement. And as a result, values vary from different groups to one another. So again, what I would say is that insight as a means for delivering culturally appropriate mental health services might be inappropriate. The fourth type of culture-bound value that we need to look at is that most forms of counseling and psychotherapy imply that the client be open in terms of talking about themselves. We want them to self-disclose. Openness and intimacy are part and parcel of effective counseling and psychotherapy. We expect them to talk about the most intimate aspects of their behavior. There is both a cultural barrier and a social political barrier that works against disclosure on the basis of culturally diverse clients who might come to work with you. Let me first of all talk about the cultural one that is operative here. Many traditional Asian clients and many Latino clients feel that one talks about the most intimate aspects of their lives only with a close acquaintance, someone close to them that they have known and trust over an extended period of time. Oftentimes, they seek friends to share their fears, their hopes, and aspirations with. Now, I want you to think about this, that even if you do not define counseling and psychotherapy as a friendship relationship, that might be precisely the definition that is coming from culturally diverse clients that you work with. And one of the things that defines cultural differences in how we define let's not call friendships, let's call a close acquaintance. The more you are close to an individual, the more you might be able to reveal or disclose aspects of what is going on with you. The Western and Eastern society defines close acquaintances differently from one another. In the United States, and if I change terms now to friendship, in the United States, friendships are formed quickly, but they are not long-lasting, nor are they obligatory. For example, many of you who might be viewing this tape now, whether it's in a workshop or a classroom setting, may consider one another friends. If you go to a workshop and meet someone, you become friends. But when you leave that workshop, you have no obligation to continue keeping in contact with one another. Now, let's talk about Eastern definitions of friendships. In Eastern cultures, friendships are formed over an extended period of time. They require much contact, much time to be able to be formed. And however, once these friendships are formed, they become binding and obligatory. Now, what do I mean by binding and obligatory? And I first encountered this when I was the graduate student advisor for the doctoral students in electrical engineering in Berkeley. And one of the things was that students from Hong Kong who were in engineering that I would know over a 3 or 4 year period, what would happen is that I would consider that I knew them. However, I didn't realize that they considered me a close acquaintance who was trusted. So that when they graduated and went back home, during special occasions, they would send me letters telling me what was going on. They remembered my birthday, and I would get a birthday card. And oftentimes, I would look at this and find it, because I was so westernized, I would find this, well, this is inappropriate. How come, boy, John Chang must have really been starved for someone. That's why he continues to write to me. Little did I understand until now that the relationship that was formed is an obligatory one. And so that is really an issue. In the United States also, what is appropriate to talk about differs from other cultural groups. In other cultural groups, you do not talk about personal issues. Now, I'd like to give this example to you, to people, to show the major difference that cultures have. When I'm flying, oftentimes I'll sit next to a passenger who is obviously bored. And maybe I've come back from a workshop or something, and I can tell that the passenger next to me is so bored they've gone through the 15th magazine quickly, and they're trying to make eye contact with me, and I know that they want to talk to me, but I'm fatigued and tired from the workshop, and I don't want to talk to them. And so I give them all these nonverbal cues, close my eyes, shift away, maybe even snore loudly so that they won't. But they'll ultimately find a reason to talk to me. For example, they'll look at the back of the seat and say, "Oh, I see that you're not reading that magazine. Do you mind if I read it?" And of course, I will say, "No, you certainly can have it." And then they'll start the conversation. This is a foot in the door. And ultimately, which is, again, a very typical Western way, the first question when you meet people and you ask them is, "What do you do?" I mean, and this really goes differently. We define people oftentimes by the work they do, what they do. And many Latino cultures, again, let me give you, it's your being and essence that implies worth, not what you do. And of course, when I'm asked that question, I know what's coming up. I'll say that, well, I'm a psychologist, and lo and behold, as expected, the passenger may turn to me and says, "You mean you're a psychologist? Do you do therapy at times?" And I said, "Sometimes." And they'll say, "I've always wanted to talk to someone about my sexual problems." And I'll go, "What?" Now I'm giving you this difficulty, but this is really a major contrast. In the United States, people feel freer to talk about intimate aspects of their lives and self-disclose, while Asian cultures, Latino cultures, you only do that with people that you have a strong, deep relationship with. Now, let us apply those cultural contrasts to the characteristic of what counseling and therapy is like. You generally go in to see a therapist once a week in a 50-minute hour. And to many culturally diverse groups, it seems inappropriate that you can form a relationship once a week, 50 minutes out of the hour. And oftentimes we find these major difficulties going on, so especially with international students who go in for counseling and help and are expected to immediately talk about the most intimate aspects of their lives. Also, I had mentioned earlier in the presentation here that many Asians don't talk about problems and mental health issues because it reflects upon the family. If I am suffering from a mental disorder, for me to talk about it reflects upon my entire family, and I may bring shame and disgrace to them. So the family does everything possible to keep it hidden from public view. And so that is another issue that oftentimes counselors and therapists are not aware of, the internal dialogue that is going on within an Asian client who may be wrestling with this very issue that is occurring here. Another aspect that makes self-disclosure so difficult for many people of color is what I call the social political dimension of trust and mistrust. Now, let us look now broadly, let's look systemically at the nature of race relations, particularly in the United States. If you look at the history of race relationships in the United States, it is the history of racism and oppression. I can give you countless examples of this. From the beginning, when the founders and the writers of the Declaration of Independence, U.S. Constitution framed it, that they escaped persecution, but did not realize that by coming to the United States, they persecuted the indigenous people of this country. If you look at the history that goes on, the enslavement of African Americans, the incarceration of the Japanese Americans, the taking away of land from Native Americans, these are all historical events that were condoned and carried out by the government of the United States. Now, I'm not at this point saying that everything is wrong with the United States. I'm saying that this history and the continuing experiences of oppression and racism forms an intimate aspect of the worldview of people of color in the United States. And so when a client of color comes in to work with you, it is often let's say let's use the example of a black client and a white counselor. That black client may come in to the counseling session and feel that the relationship that is going on represents a microcosm of race relations in the whole outside world. And that culturally different client, that black client, may come in with this thought: what makes you, the white counselor or therapist, any different from all the whites out there that have operated from stereotypes, that have discriminated against me? Is it simply because you are a therapist that is supposed to help me? Well, my teacher was supposed to educate me. My counselor was supposed to, in high school, was supposed to help me go to college, but they operated from stereotypes that in some sense prevented me from doing. What makes you, the helping professional, any different? And it is sad to say that the answer probably is that you are no different. And I say this not in terms of casting blame, but knowing that all of us in the United States here, was born and raised into a culture and a society that has stereotypes and biases. I am not saying that, for example, that white Americans are immoral, not decent, they're bad and evil. All of us in this country, most of us anyway, experience ourselves as good, moral, decent individuals. But all of us are also victims of a socialization process that imbues within each and every one of us certain prejudices and biases. These are hidden from us. And so many clients of color that you work with know that you are a good and decent individual, but maybe not in touch with your biases that potentially hurt and harm me. And as a result, I am going to test you out. Before I open up to you, I want you as a counselor or counselor or therapist to self-disclose about where you are coming from. So culturally, clients of color are likely to engage you in a series of subtle, some very overt tests or challenges, I call them, to get you to display where you are coming from. And they are going to look at not only what you say, but how you say it, the nonverbals that are going on. The challenges can be as straightforward from a black client, such as, can you even understand the black experience? How you handle that question will either enhance or negate your credibility. Or they may offhand make a comment like, what do you care about black people? Or what do whites care about black people? Or if they are involved in, let's say, an interracial relationship, the challenge can be quite blunt and direct. And they can even turn to you and say, well, what bothers me most is people telling racist jokes. Have you ever laughed at any of those racist jokes? Now, these are all challenges that are intended to get at where you are coming from. Because this is an issue of trust, mistrust. Now, let us quickly look at this comment. Have you ever laughed at a racist joke? What do you think the black client is asking of you, a white helping professional? Well, is the person asking you, in essence, are you a racist? Well, maybe at some level. But I don't believe that is what they're asking. I believe that the client probably already knows the answer to that, in that you do have racial biases. That's not what I'm asking you. Have you ever laughed at a racist joke? Has various levels. One of them that I've just talked about is, are you a racist? But like I was saying, that's not really the question that is being asked. What that black client may be asking you is this: how open and honest are you about your own racism, and will it interfere with our ability to work together? That is what is being asked here. And how you handle that question will either enhance or negate your trustworthiness. That is what is being tested here. Your trustworthiness. Are you open? Are you going to let it hang you up in one way or another? And we will talk about this issue when we have another lecture series on the manifestations of racial microaggressions in the counseling and therapy process. But it is the issue that I'm not going to trust you until you open up first. Now, I want to also say that oftentimes people of color are described as being paranoid, unable to trust others, being excessively mistrustful. And I would only say that in the 1970s, Price, Cobbs, and Greer wrote a book that they called Black Rage. And they talked about this issue that oftentimes black Americans are accused of being paranoid, that everything is due to racism. And indeed, if you were to administer a personality test in New York here to a group of white Americans, and it could measure trust, mistrust, you would generally find a bell-shaped curve, that on one end of trust, there would be fewer individuals. The majority of people would not be excessively trustful or mistrustful, and fewer would be on the mistrust end of the bell-shaped curve or the normal distribution. However, if you were to administer this test to a group of, let's say, black Americans, what are you likely to get? If this is the mistrust end of the continuum and this is the trust end, you are not going to get a normal distribution. You are most likely to get a skewed distribution where the majority of black Americans fall more on the mistrust end of the continuum. Now, the question I would ask of you is that, is this support that black Americans are paranoid and pathological? In the past, sadly to say, early research was used in this way to indicate that indeed deviance, pathology, paranoid was associated with black Americans. Well, Cobbs and Greer, two black psychiatrists that I talked about in the writing of Black Rage, the book, tended to say that we don't see it that way. Our studies indicate that black Americans who score on the mistrust end of the continuum are healthier because they exhibit functional survival mechanisms in an oppressive racist environment and city. In fact, they framed it quite differently, that indeed it is, if you are a black American and you score higher on the trust end, it may indicate that you are maladjusted because it indicates a naivete about how racism operates or a lack of contact with reality. And it's this finding that makes it very important for us to begin to reframe what it is that, in essence, what we have is many African Americans in this society being told that their racial reality is wrong, that it is paranoid, when indeed their racial reality may be a much more accurate reflection of what is going on. And when we get to this topic of racial microaggressions, we will talk about it much more carefully. The other end that I would like to, knowing that our time is coming to an end, I really want to place this all in context in terms of what does this mean for you as a culturally competent multicultural counselor and psychologist. And I would say that it becomes very important for you to unmask and deconstruct the value bases and assumptions of traditional mental health practices. They are framed from a particular cultural perspective, and if you are unaware of it and you apply it to culturally diverse clients without considering their worldview, you may be guilty of cultural oppression. So again, what I want you to leave with after this session is the integrated definition that we have proposed throughout of multicultural counseling and therapy. And I'm going to again present it to you in the hopes that you tease it apart and look at its meaning with respect to all of these issues that we've talked about today. Multicultural counseling and therapy is defined as a helping role and process that uses modalities and defines goals consistent with the life experiences and cultural values of clients. Yet that it utilizes universal and culture-specific helping strategies and roles. And we will also talk about culture-specific strategies as well in future presentations. That it recognizes client identities to include individual, group, and universal dimensions, and that it balances the importance of individualism and collectivism in the assessment, diagnosis, and treatment of client and client systems. That is really what we consider to be a definition, an integrated definition of multicultural counseling and psychotherapy. And it is incumbent upon each and every one of us to look at what it is that we do in counseling and psychotherapy, what is it that we do in helping, and how we can, in essence, provide services to an increasingly culturally diverse population. All of you know that we live in a world that is predicted that between the years 2030 and 2050, racial ethnic minorities, people of color, will become a numerical majority. None of us can do our work without encountering people who will differ from us in terms of race, culture, ethnicity. Thank you for your attention this afternoon.